Hi, I'm Ellie Mae,
And I'm Adriana.
and welcome to our crash course about The Great Gatsby. Yeah. So today we're going to talk about the very famous Roaring Twenties book by F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Great Gatsby. To give a very brief insight about The Great Gatsby, it's about living in the Jazz Age and building your way up the economic ladder. Different themes, symbols, and ideas are present in the book to really show the readers what living in the 20s was like.
So, modernism was the time period that The Great Gatsby was written in. Rapid growth in city populations and industrialization was the base plot of the novel by Fitzgerald. I think that The Great Gatsby was the poster child of the meaning of modernism. Just listen to the definition. Modernism represented the struggle that many had with the way that new ideas and discoveries challenged their previous lives during the time when tradition didn't seem so important anymore. So, now you know what modernism is. Doesn't it match the meaning of The Great Gatsby? Just like every other time period, modernism also has its popular view. Most people thought that man could do anything they wanted to do, if they put their mind to it, of course. But only great men could build their way up through hardship to fame. The difference between the modernism and every other time period was that no one believed in the American dream. Instead of relying on your fellow Americans, you get rich quick, by yourself, and don't care about anyone else. Now, switching to the great Fitzgerald, get it? From the way that Fitz displays his thoughts through his writing about how he feels about the culture of the 20s, we get the vibe that he's not a fan. From the way he describes the outrageous parties and uncontrolled drunks, we get that he finds them ignorant and privileged. F. Scott Fitzgerald shows that the people of his time who felt like the old rules and old ways of living and thinking were no longer relevant. We see that when he describes countless love affairs, parties, and useless way of living, he sees the culture as immature. Overall, we know that Fitzgerald didn't like the time that he was in and wrote a pretty passive-aggressive book to prove it.
Agreed. So, the title of the book. By the title of the book, we can tell that there is somebody in the book named Gatsby. This man, Jay Gatsby, formerly known as James Gatz, is the neighbor to the narrator of the book, Nick Carraway. Jay embodies the idea that whoever you are, whatever your background is, or situation that you were in or are in, you have the potential to be successful. So Gatsby, being a bootlegger, is a very rich man, and oftentimes with wealth, it comes with a desire to want everything. He wants it all. He wants the girl, he wants the car, the job, and the life in general.
Now, as for Gatsby's neighbor and the narrator of this book, Nick Carraway was a fairly simple man. He lived in a house which arguably needed some renovation and cleaning up of the yard. However, he didn't have any desire to fix it. Nick grew up in Chicago with his family, who had made their money in the wholesale hardware business. It's pretty fun, right?
I mean, it sounds really great. I would do that for a living.
He then went to Yale with other character Tom, who he found a love for literature. He then went to fight World War I, and afterwards he moved to West Egg, New York, to work with the bond business. Overall, Nick considers himself to be a very well-rounded person. He says himself, "I was going back to bring all such things into my life and become again the most limited of all specialists, the well-rounded man."
So Daisy Buchanan, cousin to Nick Carraway, as well as the wife to Tom Buchanan, together they had a daughter, as well as a relatively poor marriage. Tom had a mistress that everyone was aware of, but including Daisy, but no one liked to talk about it. So you could say that Daisy really liked to live her life in a careless fashion. Throughout the book, she is faced with many challenges and hard decisions to make, but she continues to remain generally indecisive. She eventually has an affair with Jay Gatsby, whom she was in love with before Tom.
As for Tom Buchanan, we know that he has been friends or at least acquaintances with Nick Carraway in college. He's husband to Daisy. Together they live in a huge mansion on East Egg, because needless to say, Mr. Buchanan's filthy rich. But most of all of his wealth was inherited because he was born into a very rich family. His character is very dominant and aggressive, which he displays in his abusive relationship with his mistress, Myrtle Wilson. He's also very hypocritical because he's having an affair, his wife's having an affair, but he's not so happy about that, and he does everything in his power to bring it to an end.
Yep. And then our last important character is Jordan Baker, the glamorous pro golfer who is friends with Daisy and Tom. She eventually becomes friends with and then dates Nick Carraway. Jordan and Nick have similar views in the sense of they don't like people who are careless. However, there's no one more careless than Jordan Baker. Maybe Daisy or Tom. However, she resembles the glamour that Daisy has, but that's pretty much where the similarities end. Daisy is more of a babbler and a giggler, whereas Jordan is hard, direct, and very cynical.
So, now that we've learned about modernism and the characters, it's time to go to the plot. The novel starts off as any other novel, with a narrator. Nick, who is the narrator, is a striving businessman who has recently moved to the West Egg, New York. Freshly out of the war, Nick rents a pretty small house to a huge mansion. Nick is welcomed by his wealthy cousin Daisy and her husband Tom and her famous golfer friend Jordan Baker, who Nick actually immediately starts a relationship with. Shortly into the hangout, Nick concludes that Daisy is not happily married to Tom and something fishy is going on in the relationship. To support his claim, Jordan tells him that Tom has a drop-dead gorgeous mistress, Myrtle, who is also married. After finding out about his affair, Tom, not caring about what Nick thinks, invited him to join him and Myrtle to a raging party in the apartment that Tom owns to have affairs with Myrtle. Weird, right? But what's even more odd is that Nick agrees to go, fully knowing what's happening. The party's kind of weird. It's a mix of drunken emotions from girls that Nick doesn't know, to Tom actually breaking Myrtle's nose. So now that we find out that Tom isn't just a lying, cheating man-ho, but is actually abusive.
So as the summer goes on, Nick receives an invitation from Gatsby himself, which is a very rare thing to happen. Nick is thrilled that he was personally asked by the great Gatsby. Nick attends this famous party with his lady friend Jordan. After meeting the legend himself, Nick is astonished at the calmness that the Great Gatsby is. After Gatsby stole Nick's lady away, Nick learns more about this mysterious man. He finds out that Gatsby is madly in love with Daisy, his cousin. Not Gatsby's cousin, that would be weird. Sweet home Alabama. Anyway, and he was in love with her before the war and during the war. So most nights we find Gatsby staring at a strange light across the water. Nick also discovers that Gatsby isn't an actual partier and only throws these parties in hopes that Daisy will come. Gatsby eventually asks a favor of Nick to arrange a tea time that they can reunite. He's too scared to ask Daisy himself because he's afraid that if she knows that Gatsby still loves her, she won't come there. So Nick does what Gatsby says and invites Daisy to his house without telling her that Gatsby will be there. And after their reunion, it's really, really awkward. But after leaving them alone for like 30 minutes, they fall madly in love again and begin their new affair.
After a short time into their relationship, Gatsby's over to Tom and Daisy's house for a luncheon. The way that Gatsby looks at Daisy is a dead giveaway that they're madly in love, and Tom doesn't like that. So even though that Tom has been cheating on Daisy for a while now, he becomes outraged and devises a plan. He splits up the group into two different cars and makes everyone drive to New York, where he ultimately confronts Gatsby. This is where it gets messy. Tom tells Daisy that Gatsby is a criminal because he's a bootlegger and involved in illegal crime. So Daisy tells Tom that she chooses him and that she actually loves him. Why? Would you rather choose a lying, cheating guy or a guy that really loves you? Whack. But anyways, Tom sends them all back to West Egg, but Tom sends Daisy back with Gatsby alone to prove that Gatsby is not a threat to him. On the way back from New York, Tom and Nick, who are in the same car, see that someone has been struck by a car and killed. Tom knows the place that they're at because this is where his mistress lives, in the Valley of Ashes. Myrtle is struck dead. They rush back to West Egg to find out that Daisy and Gatsby were in the car when they were killed, and Daisy was the one that was driving, but Gatsby pledges to protect her and take the blame. The next day, Tom decides to tell Myrtle's husband, George, that Gatsby was the one that struck Myrtle. George jumps to conclusions, and he thinks that the one driving the car was Myrtle's lover. So he decides to take things in his own hands, and the next day, George goes to a luxurious mansion of Gatsby, finds him chilling in the pool, and takes both of their lives.
So sad. So, Nick created a funeral for Gatsby, inviting all of his friends, who never attended. Here we find out that the people who claimed to be his friends were fake, and even Daisy didn't come. Nick breaks up with Jordan and moves back to the Midwest to escape the money from the greedy people. And a quote, that's my Middle West, not the wheat of the prairies or the lost wade towns, but the thrilling returning trains of my youth, and the street lamps and sleigh bells, and the frosty dark, and the shadows of holly wreaths thrown by lighted windows in the snow. Nicky explains how much more he likes the Midwest, and doesn't really know why he moved to West Egg in the first place. Nick really feels bad for Gatsby because he worked hard for what he had, but all of his relationships were full of corruptness and dishonesty, even with his lover Daisy. As Nick comments, there must have been moments, even that afternoon, when Daisy tumbled short of his dreams, not through her own fault, but because of the colossal vitality of his illusion. Jay was so blindsided by love that he would do anything for her.
So to go into the symbols, they're important, right? Because this book is full of symbols. Almost everything is a symbol. But to start off, probably the most noticeable one is the green light. The green light represents Gatsby's hopes and dreams of being with Daisy. We see him actually reaching out across the water to where Daisy lives and trying to grab that hope. Also talking about Daisy, she's actually a symbol herself. Think of what Daisy looks like. It's a white flower with a yellow or gold inside. In the book, many times the color gold comes out as representing death, and white is obviously purity. So when you think about it, we know that Daisy comes out as super pure and loving and whatever, but there's gold in her. She killed Myrtle, even if it was an accident.
So in the Valley of Ashes, which represents America's society as a wasteland, we see the eyes of Dr. TJ Eckelberg with gold-framed glasses. As previously stated, gold represents death, and the eyes are representing the eyes of God. This ties together because Daisy, who had gold in her, struck Myrtle in the Valley of Ashes under the eyes of God, meaning she'll always know who really killed Myrtle.
To go along with the symbols, there's also themes. For example, the American dream, wealth, lies, and deceit. There are many more themes, however, these will be the main ones that we'll probably be focusing on. Beginning with the American dream, we know that during this time, it is the dream to make something of yourself, and just what others think you couldn't do, you just do it, as well as to stand for independence. Gatsby originally seemed as though he would represent this theme. However, he ends up embodying the selfish pursuit of personal pleasure and material possessions. As for wealth, it is very obvious who would be betraying this theme. Everyone. Each of them are so wealthy that it seems like they can buy everything in the world. Everything except the world for one thing, happiness, which arguably is what they need the most. With that said, it still does give them a placebo that they're happy because their money lets them live the world without consequences. Lastly, we have lies and deceit. Nick really likes to say that he is the most honest person, but we all know as sinners, we slip up at one point or another. Even if other people don't notice, we still have the eyes of God looking down at us at all times. And a quote from that is, God knows what you've been doing, everything that you've been doing. You made a fool of me, but you can't fool God. Standing behind him, Michaelis saw with the shock that he was looking at the eyes of Dr. TJ Eckelberg, which had just emerged, pale and enormous, from the dissolving night. God sees everything, repeated Wilson. That's an advertisement. Michaelis assured him.
Okay, so we know the title of the book, The Great Gatsby. Why is Gatsby great? Yes, Gatsby lied about his childhood. Yes, he had an affair with a married woman. And yes, He might have been a bootlegger and was involved in some organized crime, but Gatsby's greatness overlooked all of his mistakes. Gatsby was great because he knew what he loved and who he loved, and he did everything in his power to get it or her. He looked out for his friends, who he thought were real. He welcomed Nick fully knowing that he was by no means rich or had any status behind his name. He also took the blame for Daisy killing Myrtle, fully knowing that him and her may never be together after that. And he ended up actually dying for her. Gatsby is great because even though he grew up as a poor farmer, it only took him 5 years to behold his name of being great. He worked so hard to be where he was, and he never stopped being great. Overall, Gatsby was persistent and determined. He got what he wanted. He got what he worked for and what he wanted. He never gave up. Gatsby is great and will always live in his greatness.
So that's it.
That sucked.